Good afternoon. We'll do that again. Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Seth. I'm an elder serving in Extension Ministries at Children's Mercy Hospital and St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome. It's good to be here again. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to lead us in prayer. But one of the things that came up in the last couple of conversations with the bishop and the cabinet and other chaplains was, what can we do, those of us that are chaplains in an extension ministry, to be a part of this group? So today, I am your chaplain. If you find yourself in a place where you need to process what is happening or what's being said, or just someone to talk to, or it stirs up emotions, whatever those can be, do find me. I was supposed to have a little sticker that said I'm chaplain. I didn't see that. But just look for the person that is wearing the same colors that says loving God, the blue and the red floral. I will be back in the back, outside where everyone else is, kind of where our prayer time area is. I'll be out in the foyer, so if you need anything, please do not hesitate. Know that what you say stays within this room, but I appreciate the cabinet and the bishop opening the space to us. So with that, I invite you to kind of settle in, and let's go to God in prayer. But before we do so, I just invite you to shut your eyes, take a deep breath, and breathe out as we center ourselves and slow down. One more time. Breathe in and release that breath. Gracious and holy God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather as your people, as leaders of not only your church, but your community and your world. God, you have entrusted us. You have equipped us. You have helped us be ready for times such as these. God, in the chaos, and in the worry, in the fear, in the anger, in the heartbreak, and yes, even in the love, you gather us together and remind us that we are your people and we are here to lead. For some of us, it is easy to listen and to preach and to remind people of your love. But it's not always easy, God, to speak up to the injustices of this world. During our time together, God, we just ask that you open our hearts, our ears, our minds, and our hands to your word and the work that you have for each one of us. Guide us in this time to be people that aren't creating an us and them, but who are building bridges for the transformation of this world, not just this church. God, we know that as we tell these stories and we share these experiences, that in many times we are also speaking of people that might be on that, quote, other side, people that we love dearly with our whole hearts. Calm that fire within us that wants to speak out and act out in rage. Guide us, be with us, calm us, and help us to work together as one people that spread your love and your grace to all across the land. In your name we pray, and all God's people said, amen. May it be so.
It's always nice when people show up to the first session, but it's even nicer when they show up to the second session. So we'll see by the fourth session. That's when it's really exciting. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history of how we've gotten to the problem of Christian nationalism. Because as I ended our last session, we were not founded as a Christian nation, and yet we have done a lot of things that have moved us closer towards acting like and looking like a Christian nation, which is why a lot of people think today that we are. So I want us to get us thinking about that. And one way I want us to think about that is, let's take a look at January 6th. So this is a moment from the January 6th insurrection. If you're not familiar with this, this was actually from a video by a reporter from the New Yorker, happened to be in the Senate chamber when the insurrectionists broke in. And they kind of make their way. They're looking around for evidence to prove the election was stolen, as if it was just like hanging out in the chamber. And then a couple of them make it up to the podium there in the Senate chamber. And one of them says, something like, thank you, Jesus. And just shouts of amen. And that inspired the QAnon shaman. You might remember him. He was the one that had like the face paint and the fuzzy horns, right? He's like, oh yeah, we need to pray. So he grabs the bullhorn and starts a prayer. And then he pauses and realizes they all need to take off their hats. So they take off their red MAGA hats, or he takes off his fuzzy horns. And so you can kind of see him. This is post dehorning, holding the bullhorn there. And then he continues his prayer. And it's a pretty traditional evangelical prayer, thanking God for the nation being reborn on this day, thanking God for allowing them to have this victory, and so on and so on. And so this was like the top example. When people talk about Christian nationalism on January 6th, there's some other things they point to, but this is a key moment of them literally claiming the Senate in the name of God to help the nation be reborn. But that wasn't the first prayer that had actually happened there that day. Both chambers, these are both images from January 6, 2021, both chambers had already had a moment of prayer as well. We've got Margaret Kibben there, is a Presbyterian Church USA minister who's the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, and this is Barry Black, Seventh-day Adventist minister who's the Senate chaplain. So at the point that the insurrectionists had broken in, Reverend Black had already prayed. And both of them, their prayers are honestly fairly similar. They're on the other side, but they're both praying that God would make sure the lawmakers do what they think is God's will that day. And that is certify the vote, as opposed to the prayer that would come, which was to not certify the vote. So here's the question I think is really significant. If it's Christian nationalism for people to break in on one day and offer one prayer, and I do think it is, but if that's Christian nationalism, how much more is it Christian nationalism when we literally hire someone as an employee of the U.S. government, pay them with taxpayer money to pray every single day as part of the official business of the United States Congress, and then write word for word every word of their prayer and put it in the congressional record? So I would argue that that's also Christian nationalism. Even right now when the government's shut down and they do their pro forma sessions, right? They'll say the prayer, they'll say the pledge, and then gavel, and that's it. That's the business of the day right now in the House of Representatives, is a prayer and a pledge and a couple of announcements. And that is Christian nationalism. But here's the deal. This is the Christian nationalism that we mainline Protestants have been leading. And actually, of all of the 200 chaplains between the House and the Senate, the denomination that has had the most chaplains in American history are branches of Methodism, pre-United Methodist as well as the United Methodist today. But Methodism is the family that has had the most, followed by our Episcopalians, our Presbyterians, and American Baptists. Those four branches of the mainline family account for 83% of all congressional chaplains, just in those. And then most of the rest are mainline Protestants. There's one Adventist who's currently the Senate chaplain. There's been a couple of Catholics, a couple of Unitarians, and that's it. There's actually never been anyone from any of the evangelical denominations today that has been chaplain or charismatic or Pentecostal and so forth. This has been an area that mainline Protestants have dominated. And so we have this tale of two different January 6th, right? We have the insurrectionists. Here's a Christian flag being carried in There was also Bibles and other signs about Jesus. These were some of the other signs of Christian nationalism on that day. But then we also have January 6th of 2022. So exactly 1 year later, we have, this is mostly Democrats in Congress that gathered together. Representative Cheney was, I think, the only Republican that participated in the ceremony to mark the 1 year anniversary. And so when this was about to happen, it was billed as a prayer vigil being led by Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. So I went and turned on C-SPAN because I'm a nerd. I watched C-SPAN 2 as well. I mean, it's just what I do. And so I went to turn on the service to see what was going to be said during this prayer vigil. And it was really short. I was surprised by that. It also was not interfaith at all, which I actually had expected it to be. Instead, only one preacher spoke, only one clergy member spoke, and it was the then presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Bishop Curry, who's there at the podium at that moment. And he prayed that we would be one nation under God, and that God's will would be done here in this building. They sang a couple of patriotic Christian hymns that we sing on the 4th of July-ish Sundays, right, in a lot of churches. And then Nancy Pelosi, who's Catholic, led a moment of silent prayer, and that was it. And imagine if today, if Speaker of the House Mike Johnson held a prayer vigil on the steps of the Capitol and only had Christian songs led by, let's say, Sean Foyt, the Christian musician, and then invited Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Dallas or Paula White Cain or, one of those preachers to come and lead a prayer to make this one nation under God. If that had happened, we would call it Christian nationalism. This is also Christian nationalism when it comes from the left, when it comes from Democrats not learning the lesson of what had happened a year before. Right? The January 6th House Committee report, which does a really good job of doing a lot of uncovering about January 6th, ignores the topic of Christian nationalism. There's literally as many references to Islamic terrorism in the January 6th committee report, which was not even a topic of that day, it's just a reference to something else, as there are to Christian nationalism, and it's in a footnote, because it's in the title of a news article that they happen to cite. They completely ignored the subject. And instead, they seem to think the lesson was, what we actually just need is a kinder, friendlier, cuddlier version of Christian nationalism, right? We're going to come and claim Jesus on our side, but we're not going to storm the Capitol while doing it. And this is what I'm arguing is the problem that we have to deal with, is recognizing that Christian nationalism is not just something that happens when Trump supporters invade the Capitol. The problem of Christian nationalism is much broader. So let's think about it this way. When the media talks about Donald Trump and religion, and particularly when they talk about Donald Trump and evangelicals, there's an image, I probably don't need to tell you this part. Normally when I'm doing conversations, I tell people who the mainline Protestants are, but all right, here's the Seven Sisters. Congratulations, you're on there, right? So this is the mainline Protestants. This is who I'm talking about when I talk about mainline Protestants, which of course is always funny when we have the evangelical Lutheran Church, who are actually mainline Protestant and not evangelical, because words change in meaning over time. Isn't that cool or sick or, any of those other kind of words we could talk about that have changed in meaning over time. So when the media talks about Donald Trump today and talk about Trump and evangelicals, they like to post this image. I'm sure you've seen it. It happens in news articles still all the time. Now, this is from June 1st of 2020. You may recall this was during the time of Black Lives Matter protests, and there had been a scare a couple days before, and he had been ushered down in the basement. He thought it made him look weak, so he wanted to look strong. So they tear gassed the crowd out in front of the White House there, Lafayette Square, and including an Episcopal priest who was standing on church property, got driven away. And so he walks across with some military officers. They walk across, and he holds up the Bible. And doesn't give any remarks. They've actually been requested by aides, like, why don't you go say something or say a prayer or read from the text? And instead he just holds it up until a reporter finally says, is that your Bible? And his response was, it's a Bible. It wasn't actually his Bible. I guess he was, we later found out it was Ivanka's Bible. She had pulled it out of her $3,200 purse. And so what is funny about this image today, when the media always puts it up there about Trump and evangelicals, is there's literally nothing evangelical in that picture. There are only 3 things in that picture. 4 if you count the bush, but I don't think it's evangelical either. So there's the church, right? This is St. John's Episcopal Church. This is actually the parish house that's attached to the building. Right across the street from the White House, St. John's Episcopal Church, right? So one of the 7 sisters. They like to call themselves the Church of the President, and they're really proud of that declaration. The signs in front of the church actually announce that every president since James Madison has attended a service there. I think they're cheating a little bit with Joe Biden. He went when he was vice president. I don't think he actually went when he was president, but I guess that still counts. So, right, but every president since James Madison has attended a service at St. John's, and they're really excited about that. So that's an Episcopal church. Then there's the Bible. And I know it might be odd to say that the Bible is a mainline Protestant Bible, but that's the Revised Standard Version. So the Bible that, yeah, there you go. We got some Revised Standard Version fans in here. I don't know, maybe New Revised Standard. We could start the debate here. So this is actually a Revised Standard Version. They didn't have the new one. They just had the Revised Standard that she pulled out of her purse. So he's holding up a Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And I always feel like I have to do a little fact checking here. Sorry to be annoying, but he's not actually holding it upside down. I know people like to make that joke. But we have pictures of the spine, which is why we know which version of the Bible is. He holds it awkwardly, but he actually doesn't hold it upside down. So, sorry, I know, fact-checking always ruins a good joke. But so the Bible is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. I'm going to actually talk more about that Bible in a moment. And then there's the president himself, who's also a product of the mainline Protestant tradition, as much as we may not want to admit it sometimes. So he grew up in a Presbyterian Church USA congregation, was confirmed in that. He was married in a Reformed church that had a Methodist pastor, and who performed his first 2 weddings. His 3rd wedding was at an Episcopal church, right? So he's a lifelong product of the mainline tradition. In fact, to the point that he's holding this Bible, he's still a lifelong member of the Presbyterian Church USA. He would announce a few months later that he was leaving, become a non-denominational Christian. He's only attended a Sunday service 1 time since leaving office. If you don't count inaugurations and funerals, he's been to church 1 time, and that was in December of 2021 at First Baptist Church of Dallas. We talked about them with the fireworks. And they had him come up and speak at the end of the service. And so he's basically a nun now, if you will, the N-O-N-E-S, right? But at this point, he's a lifelong mainline Protestant. And this is what so much of the media is missing about what's happening in religion today, and what I think we often can miss, is this picture is played anytime there's a story about Trump and evangelicals and there's nothing evangelical in the picture. So maybe we need to think then about why all of these mainline Protestant things are there in this Christian nationalistic moment, right? So we can think about the other really famous Trump Bible moment when he started selling Bibles. Not just any Bible, the God Bless the USA Bible. So this is made out of Christian nationalism central casting. It has a flag on the cover. And then inside are the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Pledge of Allegiance and what every Bible needs, the lyrics to Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA. I want you to make a quick little side note on the Constitution. Actually, it's only the Constitution and then the Bill of Rights. There's not any of the later amendments. So in that Bible/Constitution, slavery is still legal, women can't vote, and presidents can serve as many terms as they want. They didn't print the rest of the amendments in there. And, this was criticized. Late night comics had fun with it. Right? Representative Cheney suggested he go read this verse in Exodus, the one about not committing adultery. People had fun and people criticized this. But before Trump hawked the Bible, there's this moment with Harry Truman. This is one of those weird moments of Baptizing America. So Baptizing America came out in June of 2024, but means we had finished writing it and turned it in November or October, I forget, in 23. So we had this moment when we talk about this, where imagine if Donald Trump held a ceremony in the Rose Garden and people came with a Bible, right, all this kind of stuff. And then in between the book coming out, he starts selling Bibles. And we're we don't have to imagine that very much. So this is the very first copy of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, right there, being handed by the head of the translation committee to President Harry Truman in the Rose Garden, may it rest in peace, in an official White House ceremony to celebrate the release of the first Bible, of the Revised Standard. The National Council of Churches wanted Truman's blessing and stamp of endorsement, which he gave. He talked about how if everyone would just read this Bible, they would understand his foreign policy, and there would be peace around the world, and see how much that he was following, right? So he gives this official endorsement of it. Luther Weigel there, the head of the translation committee, is not only ordained in 2 different mainline Protestant denominations and leading the National Council of Churches committee. He was the dean of the Divinity School at Yale. He's a prominent figure in mainline Protestant life. He's also someone that really wanted us to be a Christian nation, by the way. So a few years after this moment, he testifies in this little court case in Pennsylvania, Abington School District, Shemp v. Abington School District, that eventually gets up to the Supreme Court. And that's the case where the United States Supreme Court said, you cannot make school children listen to 10 Bible verses being read every single day, and you also cannot make them say the Lord's Prayer in public school classrooms, right? So like I said, he had testified in the lower court on this case in favor of the school district, arguing that the school should make the children listen to the reading of the Bible because it really wasn't sectarian, even though they were using the King James Version, right? That it was just the good American values that they were learning with this. And he's so upset by the Supreme Court decision that he repeatedly writes to members of Congress and works to try to get the Judiciary Committee of the Senate to create a constitutional amendment to allow government prayer and Bible readings in public schools. He was ultimately unsuccessful in that effort in the early 80s, but that's what he wanted. So this is who's pushing the new Bible translation there with Truman. And Truman is, he's one of those unique figures. I feel a lot of kinship to Truman, not just because he's from Missouri, but he also bounces around a lot in the Baptist world. So he's sometimes Southern Baptist, he's sometimes American Baptist. In D.C., he's an American Baptist. But you never know which church he's going to be a part of in his career. So this is one of those moments of how we've helped lead to this moment. But honestly, I think the best story in thinking about what have mainline Protestants done to help create Christian nationalism is putting under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, if you didn't know, the Pledge of Allegiance was originally godless. It didn't include under God in it. When it was written by a Baptist socialist pastor, and I probably have to stop there because Baptist socialist pastor sounds a little weird. We don't normally put those 2 terms together, and I'm not being derogatory. Francis Bellamy called himself both. Actually, it's why he got fired from his American Baptist church was because of his socialism. So I guess that's probably not too surprising. He was vice president of a national Christian socialist organization. And so because he's struggling with the whole getting a job in the church thing, he's writing for a magazine. It's a magazine that funds itself by selling American flags. And so to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival, they decided to write a pledge to the United States flag because that would probably increase sales of the flag and thus fund the magazine, right? So this Baptist socialist pastor writes the Pledge of Allegiance and does not put the phrase under God in it. And it stays that way for 6 decades. And then it all changes because of one sermon. One of the 2 reasons why I really love this story. It's so easy to get from point A to point B. Like, we know why under God is in the Pledge of Allegiance, and it's because of one sermon, which is pretty amazing. I mean, I'm just excited when people remember my sermon like 2 days later. Like, this sermon in 4 months changes the United States Pledge of Allegiance, right? So it happens at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. That's Reverend George Dockery there next to President Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Reverend Dockery knew that President Eisenhower was going to be coming and visiting his church for Lincoln Sunday. This church is just a couple of blocks from the White House, and so Abraham Lincoln had come and visited the church some while he was in office. They have the pew, right? That's Lincoln's pew where he slept during the services, and it's like, make sure you're all still awake. That's good. We have the pew where Lincoln sat, right? They have Lincoln's pew, and then around Lincoln's birthday, they have Lincoln Sunday. So they have a big special service. So Eisenhower's the invited guest. Reverend Dockery knows that Eisenhower's going to be there. So he plans his whole sermon for an audience of 1. I don't necessarily recommend that as a pastoral approach. Although I will be completely honest, I've never had the president sitting in this congregation, so I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. But anyways, he preaches the sermon, and the whole point of the sermon is you should put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, That's the point of the sermon. Right? And so I've read through the sermon, and it starts off in very kind of Christian nationalist approach, right? He's building Christian history. He's claiming we were founded as a nation on the Ten Commandments and the words of Jesus of Nazareth, that Christianity is the defining characteristic of the American way of life. And then he talks about growing up in Scotland with the phrase, God save the king. And he was surprised then to come to the United States and be like, why don't we have a declaration like that? So he decided the way to prove that who we really were, our American way of life, was to add under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. He frames this as a theological battle because we are in a war with the godless, atheistic Soviet Union. And he frames that as a theological war, right? And so we need to make sure that we're making it very clear which side God is on. And one way we can do that is putting under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Right? Now, it was successful. Right? Because the president had gone, some media went, and so he got some attention. The next day, members of Congress are writing the church asking for a copy of the sermon. It gets played on the radio. Excerpts are printed in newspapers. This is back in the time when they would put the news on the movie theater screen, like before the main attraction, right? They played clips of the sermon in the movie theaters. It's like the news before the main attraction. Like, it was a big deal. Like I said, Congress passes the change on Flag Day, June 14th, 1954. President Eisenhower signs into law this change. And just like that, the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance has God stamped into it because of one sermon. Now, the other reason I really like the story is it also shows us the exclusionary danger of Christian nationalism. Not just we can see very quickly point A to point B how a change happened. Because in his sermon, Reverend Dockery says the quiet part out loud. Like, he's going along, and he's like, now, there might be some people who, if we make this change, can't say the pledge because they don't believe in God. And then he says, that's fine. Because he says that an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. And adds that they really are spiritual parasites. Yeah, so he's doing that fusing and confusing of American and Christian identities. He's explicitly saying in the sermon that convinces Eisenhower to do this, that if you cannot declare yourself under God, if you do not believe in God, you're not a real American and you don't count. So from the beginning, putting this in is a way of excluding some people, excommunicating some people from the body politic. And so, now it was problematic, but back then that was like 2 or 3% of the American population that said that they didn't believe in God. Most people, we were a highly Protestant nation, we were a mostly Christian nation, right? You had a couple percent that were Jewish, a couple percent that were other faiths, but more than 90% are claiming to be Christian. Today, it's more like 20%. 25% that are unaffiliated, right? And so now the exclusionary nature of a statement like this is much more significant, much more problematic than it was back then. Christian nationalism did kind of unite us in 1954, right? But today it's much more divisive in our more pluralistic society. And yet, we haven't really reckoned with this history. So when I was in D.C. One time last year, I walked over to the church, and they have this big plaque celebrating their role of their pastor in getting under God put in the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's a progressive congregation still celebrating what they did. And I should note as a side that, like, there's a lot of things about Reverend Dockery that I find very inspiring. He's a prophetic figure in a lot of ways. So he sees Bloody Sunday happen, and Martin Luther King Jr. puts out the appeal and says, I want white clergy to come and march with us. And he goes and does it. He goes and marches with King in Selma. Later, he has King come and preach to his white congregation just a couple months before King was assassinated. And Reverend Dockery himself even preached against the Vietnam War while Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was in the congregation. Right? There's a lot that really inspires me about him and his prophetic vision. But see, as progressive as he was, he also wanted us to be a Christian nation. He just wanted us to be a progressive Christian nation. And the irony is, he helped create the infrastructure that's now used and invoked by a lot of people to undermine and undo everything that he marched and preached for, right? Because the Christian nationalism, the under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, is now used for a completely different political agenda. He laid the foundation, he laid the groundwork that's undermining everything that he fought for. And so what I want you to hear from this is, I am not suggesting that the solution to conservative Christian nationalism is liberal Christian nationalism. I'm suggesting that we don't want any type of Christian nationalism, that it all ends up undermining the gospel witness. I'm going to talk about another figure. This is for all the Kansasites in here, right? Anyone? No one? All right, this is Frank Carlson of Kansas, U.S. Senate, Governor, U.S. House of Representatives. He was kind of a big deal for a while. Yeah? All right. We're going to talk to your fifth grade social studies teachers about that one. Frank Carlson is the person most responsible for the National Prayer Breakfast. He was a member of the Senate at the time. He gets us established. He's also an American Baptist layman, and he results in creating this alongside a Methodist minister. They're the two that create the National Prayer Breakfast. This is that thing that today people come together and, we get the president speaks, and it's always brought up. Every year, it's usually in February, it's brought up as, look at this Christian nationalism that's happening in the Capitol. They're all talking about Jesus and how we need to base our government on him. This is Christian nationalism. And here's where it came from. It was created from the mainline Protestant tradition by an American Baptist politician and a Methodist minister. And this was the plan, the vision of making the nation, quote, more Christian. So this is a shot from earlier this year in Statuary Hall of the National Prayer Breakfast. And in case you can't tell who's at the podium, this is the person who was the lead MC this year. They always alternate every year between the Senate and the House. They alternate between Republicans and Democrats. So this year, the lead person was Senator Maggie Hassan, a liberal Democrat who's a member of the United Church of Christ congregation in New Hampshire. It seems that very few things bring the two parties together than a nice, dose of Christian nationalism and muffins for breakfast, right? I mean, this is the thing when the two parties come together and they're like, hey, let's all talk about how we're a Christian nation now. And so we very much have a bipartisan problem when it comes to Christian nationalism, and it's still being led in many ways by some mainline Protestants, not just by evangelicals or Pentecostals. So I want to stop here and have us think about a question of how can we engage in the public square without addressing Christian nationalism. And I'm raising this question because we just saw an example of someone who was a very progressive figure who's wanting to change the public life, but also ended up pushing Christian nationalism. And I have some thoughts I want to share on this, but I first want to give you all a chance to think about this. And so we're going to take a break and let you talk at your table. And I want you to pause and think about this question, because I don't want the solution to be we stay out of the public square or that we silence our faith. The separation of church and state is not the separation of religion and politics. It's not the separation of faith from the public square. But at the same time, being mindful of the danger of Christian nationalism, how do we engage in the public square as ministers, as Christians, fully being ourselves without pushing Christian nationalism? So I want to give you a few minutes to think about that and talk about that at your table, and then we'll continue the conversation about that. All right. I want to give us a chance to kind of think about this more as a larger group. And so I'm going to ask if anyone wants to share. And I know we've got a couple people with microphones, so you can raise your hand. As you're thinking about whether if you want to share your answer to this question, I was asked about the Methodist minister who helped create the National Prayer Breakfast, and it was not someone from Kansas. So it was in Oregon and Washington. So anyways, are we up? Yeah. Okay. So we got a hand over here, and I think we want to try to share a few answers to thinking about how we engage in the public square without advancing Christian nationalism.
I've done a couple things and I'm not sure if they meet your standard, but one is I have organized the local National Day of Prayer service in the community that I was serving in, trying to do it in a way that was patriotic and not nationalist. So, and in a subtle way, modeling the fact that Democrats can also be patriotic. And the other thing I've done is volunteered to work the polls at the last 2 presidential elections as a way of also indicating that Democrats can be active citizens.
Got a hand here.
I have an answer and then a question. May I ask a question also?
Sure.
We talked about how, like in hospitals, chaplains go in and need to be present spiritually to all people, regardless of what their faith background is, or no faith background. And so that's maybe a potential model for us about how to engage spirituality in a way that's not exclusively Christian. My question is, through your presentation, I just am gobsmacked about how complete the overlay is between Christianity and politics. And it's really hard for me to imagine what political discourse sounds like that doesn't include some prayers and God bless America and that kind of thing. So can you point us to a country that doesn't have this deeply interwoven religiosity with politics?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so we're actually fairly unusual in the amount of religious rhetoric that we have in our politics, which is actually kind of interesting. So like even the countries that have an official state church today, no one talks about it because it doesn't bring people together, and more cynically, it doesn't attract voters, right? If no one actually goes to church and no one actually believes, why would you talk about it? I mean, if we want to think about why we see so much religious rhetoric in the public square, I'm gonna try to keep this really brief. But so my dissertation was literally on religious rhetoric in presidential campaigns, 1976 to 2008, and the argument that I make is that's when things changed. We candidates, politicians, presidents didn't usually talk about faith in as explicitly Christian ways as they do now. And it started in part because Jimmy Carter was just being Jimmy Carter. And in fact, some of his early advisors actually wanted him to talk about his faith less than he was. And then they realized it was resonating. So they quit telling him to stop that. Because in the post-Watergate, Vietnam War, all that kind of stuff, people were looking for someone that they could trust and they could care, and they thought cared about them, right? And that trust, that morality, they saw, oh, here's a Sunday school teacher, right? Like that's trustworthy. And so that's why it was resonating and working. And then ironically, it became a weapon used against him. And so what I argue in my dissertation that later became a book, I don't have it here. You can find it if you want to read something a little bit more academic. Is that ever since then, the candidate who has talked the most about religion, not who is the most religious, the candidate who has talked the most about religion has won the general election every single time. And so he ironically got out-God-talked by Ronald Reagan, who's someone who rarely went to church, right? And so that became then a political strategy, because whenever someone wins, then everyone's like, how did they win? Why did they win? I need to do that. So like when Obama won in 2008, everyone was like, I got to get on Facebook, right? I got to get on social media. That's how Obama got the young people. And so every candidate went on social media, right? And now we're moving into like a podcasting era, right? Like how do we get more on podcasts? That's how we win. Well, faith became just another political weapon. And so we've had this era over the last, 4.5 decades of candidates talking about religion. But yeah, if you go to like, most of your Western European democracies, they're not talking about faith in that way. It's much more surprising. In fact, it sometimes causes controversy when a candidate is more religiously outspoken. Even in Canada, that has been an issue when they've had a prime minister talk more about religion than others. A couple others on thinking about this, and I want to share an example as we think about how do we engage in the public square without advancing Christian nationalism, inadvertently or advertently. See a hand in the back, and
one thing that was really convicting that I saw a few days ago was New York City Democratic candidate Zoran Mamdani He's a devout Muslim, and he was surrounded by a group of black Christian clergy, and they were praying over him. And they were praying just as any other Christian cleric would. And it was convicting for me because I thought, if it was the other way around, or if I was in that position, would I feel as comfortable as Zoran did in that moment? And I think probably the answer would be no, unfortunately, for me right now. So it was just a really convicting moment, seeing how comfortable he was receiving that, but then thinking, what about the other way?
Yeah, because when you're a religious minority, you learn to be comfortable when people just assume, right, that they're going to use their religious expression. And I think that's one of the things we have in the United States as a majority Christian, that we just assume, well, of course, this is culturally acceptable, that I'm going to pray over someone of a different faith, in that way. And so I do think, and we see this dynamic, right? We have a number of political figures in both parties that are of different traditions, and they're not treated with the same, respect. There's controversy anytime someone who's not Christian is invited to pray before Congress, right? Even though we have literally a Christian prayer all the other days. There's controversy when Keith Ellison swore into office on the Quran because he's Muslim. There's been controversy the last couple of days with FBI Director Kash Patel for wishing people happy Diwali. And that is actually his faith tradition. Ramaswamy is facing this in Ohio. He went to a Turning Point USA event as he's trying to be the Republican nominee in Ohio, and is pushed for being, Hindu and not Christian enough. And how is he going to keep them, the Ohio's Christian culture, right? So we can see this kind of soft, almost bigotry, but also Christian nationalism there, impacting candidates of various parties.
So in addition to serving as a pastor, I'm also the chair of the board for Kansas Interfaith Action, which is a political advocacy group in the state of Kansas. But we are intentionally interfaith. Our executive director is a Jewish rabbi. I'm the chair of the board. The vice chair is a member of another mainline denomination. The secretary is a Muslim woman, and the board is intentionally made up of representatives from various mainline and non-mainline denominations, faith traditions, intentionally varying racial and age demographics. We know that our group, our advocacy organization, isn't going to be able to dismantle the framework of Christian nationalism that is operating all around us. But we are presenting the fuller voice. So if I am going to testify about a bill or to meet with legislators, I will first say, I'm speaking from my faith tradition, but I also represent a diverse coalition of other people of faith, and we advocate or value these things. And that intentional coalition building is really important, I think. I, as a white woman in a mainline tradition, have a much larger platform than many of the other people that we are in coalition with. But I can use that platform then to amplify the voices and perspectives of the other people we are working with.
Yeah, I do think the interfaith side is a really significant way that helps us guard against, right, a temptation of getting into Christian nationalism. You see this even with, the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., who was very outspoken about his faith. He was a pastor, and yet at the same time, he would deliberately march arm in arm with, rabbis, and keeping that interfaith aspect of it, so that it wasn't about centering and empowering one religious tradition over the others. I think we can take one more.
I guess I want to ask first, is it okay, because when we talk about without advancing nationalism, Is it okay if I asked you a question about the matter? Because there is one thing that, it's a story that was connected to our last election. There's a video of Kamala Harris at a rally, and somebody says Jesus is Lord, and it was reported that those people were hecklers rather than supporters. But I guess she said, "You're at the wrong rally." And I guess she kind of inadvertently, perhaps, communicated that she didn't want the Christian vote, or at least support. So I guess my question is, at what point does this concept go too far?
So I'm going to separate the example from the question, because I actually still think it's a really good question. But I also want to separate the example because, unfortunately, we do live in a moment where like political claims on social media go really, really fast. And so I'm actually going to suggest that she was responding to something else and she didn't hear the statement despite the viral. And the reason I'm going to say this is I actually wrote about this. And so I was going to put a plug in later, but I read a newsletter on faith and politics. It's called A Public Witness. If you go to publicwitness.wordandway.org, if you Google, if you type in the search bar, maybe Harris, Jesus, you'll probably get the piece. I actually look at both the video evidence and isolated the audio and ramp up what audio is picked up on her microphone, because there's actually multiple hecklers that are happening at the same time. And the person who shouts Jesus is Lord is way back in the back of the arena. And the voice that she seems to hear, because it's the only voice that is picked up on her microphone right in front of her face, is saying something else that's completely different and not religious. And that's who she seems to be looking at. So she seems to be responding to, "You're at the wrong rally," to somebody who said something else. And then there's also another heckling statement, which again, if we're using Jesus as Lord as a heckling statement, I'm a little nervous about that. But like that's also happening. So I just kind of want to separate that. It's unfortunately though that like that claim just goes on about getting fact checked. I feel really confident saying, because like I said, so I do podcasting, so I use that software just to isolate the audio and figure out what she seems to be hearing, and it's a completely different statement. At the same time, the secular left can sometimes go way too far in pushing out voices of faith, and I think that is actually a real problem, even though I don't think that example was one of it. And I've seen this in doing some work in the Missouri Capitol, that sometimes, and it's gotten better the last several years, but early on when I would show up, trying to offer a Christian voice against Christian nationalism, you could see that some of the liberal groups that were showing up from a more secular space didn't want to put a Christian voice in at all, because they're fighting the Christians, right? And not recognizing the fact that there are Christians who are against Christian nationalism, not just Christians that are for Christian nationalism. And so trying to convince them to give us a space, and to give a space for interfaith voices to be part of the pushback is sometimes really difficult. And so it's definitely a problem. And I think part of that is that natural mirror reaction, right? We want to do the exact opposite of whatever the other side is doing, whatever the other side is, right? And so if the other side's talking about Christian faith too much, then we don't want to talk about it at all. And part of what I'm wanting us to do is to reclaim what Christianity and what Scripture is really about, as opposed to going in with Christian nationalism or tossing it all out. And so I do think that's actually a real concern. So let me share a little bit as well as how I try to answer this question, because I think it's a serious one to be worried about. I see what happened in the late 40s, throughout the 50s, early 60s, during this period of mainline Protestant dominance, right? When mainline Protestants are leading culture, and they're like, all right, let's make this country godly, let's put in our values, let's put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And then culture shifted, and the dominant religious group shifted to evangelicals, and now it's shifting again to charismatic and Pentecostals, even though the media often calls them evangelicals. And I grew up in an evangelical church. Paula White Cain would never have been considered an evangelical. Prosperity Gospel would have never been as an evangelical, and she's head of the Evangelical Advisory Committee. So, right? But it's really got this charismatic Pentecostal movement that's now taking over as well from evangelicals. But the infrastructure that was built right? To create one vision of Christian nationalism is now being used for a different vision. So I'm always worried about what are we doing that might just replace one problematic expression of Christian nationalism with another. So when I go and testify in the Missouri legislature, testified about 40 times in the last 6 years, usually on Christian nationalism stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But a couple times I've gone and testified on bills related to capital punishment. Missouri's the third worst state right now on the number of people that we're executing. Just killed one last week who was a Christian minister in prison, a really inspiring figure doing a lot of work inside prison, and also had some innocent claims, right? And but when I go and testify on bills to try to limit capital punishment, we're like, our lawmakers aren't even trying to abolish it. They're just like, how can we make it used a little bit less? I will identify myself very quickly as a Baptist minister. Just make sure they know who I am. And while it's true, my faith has driven me there, I don't talk about it then, because they're not all Christians. And I'm not trying to convince them to vote a certain way because of my faith. And so I'm trying to make an argument to them why I think they should vote for this bill to limit capital punishment, that no matter what their politics are, no matter what their party is, no matter what their faith is, no matter what their religion is, that I can get them to think about supporting this legislation. And that's what I mean by engaging in the public square in ways that aren't advancing Christian nationalism. I'm trying to convince them to vote a certain way without needing to accept my religious tradition to get there. Right? Trying to reach them wherever they might be, making arguments that a Christian, a Jew, an atheist, anybody could vote for. And I think that's a difficult job. Like, honestly, going in the public square and being a Christian nationalist is a lot easier. It'd be a lot easier just to say, thus saith the Lord, and if you don't vote like this, you're a bad Christian, right? I mean, like, that would be a whole lot easier. I get the temptation. It's much more difficult work to try to, like, how do we preserve the rights of everyone in this pluralistic society? That's harder to do. And it's more difficult to do. And it's uncomfortable to do a lot of times. But we've seen that the attempts to do Christian nationalism, even with good means, even with good politics, right? It always ends up going poorly. It never works out. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because it's never worked out in human history of putting the church with the state. It's never worked out. Christian nationalism has always failed. My favorite comment about this comes from Tony Campolo, who I mentioned last session, and he said that mixing church and state is like mixing manure and ice cream. It doesn't hurt the manure, but it sure messes up the ice cream. Right? Like, it's never gone well for the church when it's gotten into bed with the state, ever. Right? It's always just ended up for more power for the people in politics, and the Christian witness has been harmed every single time. And so that's why I think we have to find ways to still engage in the public square, to still try to work to bring about justice, right? To still try to work into making the society better for everyone without demanding that people become our kind of Christian in order to get to whatever political bill or position that we're pushing. And you also want to look outside of the public square of where else does Christian nationalism show up. We had someone hinted about this in the last session, right? And I'm not picking on you. I literally, whenever I do this slide, I always change it to whatever denomination I'm with, because every denomination, in Baptizing America, for that, I actually went through and looked at all of the mainline Protestant denominational hymnals, and they all failed. They all have the section of the Christian nationalistic songs. My favorite part of that, actually my favorite part in writing the whole book is in that section. I also critique our own publisher for a hymnal that they published with these kind of songs. I already told you I got kicked out of seminary, and then I'm criticizing our publisher in our book, so that might tell you a little bit about my personality. More recently, I've learned I'm an Enneagram 8, if that tells you anything. So yeah, the United Methodist hymnal, or any hymnal, right, has the God and Country section. Sometimes we put in the national anthem, which is like not even religious, except for when it shows up in the hymnal, we usually have the first verse and the fourth verse, because the fourth verse is the only one that has God in there anywhere. All right? So we want to try to pretend like it's a religious song, but it's not. But God Bless America, Faith of Our Fathers, which was written for the 100th anniversary of the Constitution by an Episcopal minister. It was actually The Episcopal Church had commissioned that hymn. But we put in these hymns in our songs, and then, we sing them, right? And we stick them in there with songs about the birth and the teachings and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, as if all of these are dealing with the same kind of sacred things to celebrate. Some of the songs, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, even go further, theologically problematic in suggesting that the death of soldiers is on par as a salvific kind of death like that of Jesus. Okay? And so gets almost kind of close to what Patriarch Kirill's doing in Russia and justifying Ukraine, and so the invasion of Ukraine. And so, I think these songs can be problematic in this kind of slow, gentle, soft discipleship over generations to see God and country, right? To see them as together, even though Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters. You can only actually serve one. And in the moment, then when are we going to find that moment when they come into conflict as they will? Right, and I know criticizing hymnals is probably controversial, but it's going to be really tame compared to the next one. I know, I can't help myself. So yeah, the American flag in the churches, in the sanctuary a lot of times, or on the flagpole outside the church. And I do think the sanctuary is the worst. The further away you get from the sanctuary, maybe the less problematic it gets. We sometimes then try to make ourselves feel better by putting the Christian flag up there as well, right? So we got two kingdoms going now, right? We're citizens of both kingdoms. That's fine, except when we do it like this. So this church has a short stage, but we've got them. This church is following the U.S. flag code. So when the flags are on stage, right, you put the American flag to the speaker's right, and any other flag goes to the speaker's left. Actually, the U.S. flag code actually says the speaker or clergyman's right, which to me is a really alarming moment that Congress is working on a flag code. And the time that a flag most likely will appear will be next to a pastor, right? To the speaker or clergyman's right, the U.S. flag code, and that's the U.S. flag goes, and that's the place of superior prominence. So what that means is, if we were to, instead of the Christian flag, put up the Nebraska flag in this church, right? We'd put the American flag where it is, and we'd put the Nebraska flag off to the left. Or if we were to put up the Rotary Club, right? We'd put American flag on the right and the Rotary Club flag on the left. You see what we're saying? America first, Rotary second. America first, Nebraska second. America first, Christian second? Right? I mean, that's what we're saying when we follow the U.S. flag code, and we do it on our flagpoles as well, right? If they're on the same pole, the American flag goes on top, and then any other flag, that would include the Christian flag, or if they're on separate poles, the American flag pole is supposed to be taller. And there's even an ordering that you can do there according to U.S. flag code. Right? So what we've been saying here is we've already been answering the question. Jesus said you cannot serve two masters. We've already said which one's over the other. Right? Winston Churchill said, we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. We shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. And so for generations, we've been subtly discipling people into seeing these two flags as synonymous and going together, and if there's a conflict, this one's over the other one. And this is generally a new phenomenon. I think that's really important to understand. Right? That this is not something that historically has gone back very far. Most flags in churches show up during World War II. Now, your church might be a little bit different. There are some differences. Some German immigrant communities, the flags show up during World War I, right, as a way of them trying to identify themselves and their church as loyal to the U.S., not to the Kaiser. There's a few during the Civil War, but not really many. That flag flying culture just wasn't a thing back then like it has become. In most churches, the U.S. flag shows up during World War II, which means that while it has been there for all of our lifetime, or almost everyone in this room, or at least our memory lifetime, for the few of you that are a little bit older, right? But it's been there. It feels like, oh, this is the way it's always been. It's just the way you do a church building. But it's not actually been there very long. Right? I mean, in the church that I'm a member of, that means it's been there for less than half of the church's lifetime. Maybe if it's only been there for 80 years, and some of your churches are probably older than that as well. And then, going back to older to Christianity America in general, or obviously even Christianity in general, right? This is a very short time period that we've been flying a national flag in the sanctuary. And it's something that people in other countries generally find odd. Right? When they come to visit and they see the American flag in the sanctuary, they think it's weird. Because you don't find that very often. It has started to grow in the last couple of decades because we like to export all of our bad ideas. And so we're starting to see some countries where they're putting up their national flag in their church. But even when I travel, I still see it rarely. I've started to see it a few times, but very rarely to see a national flag in the sanctuary. And it makes sense because we're supposed to be serving a global God and we're part of a global faith. And to stamp this in any suggestion that this is a sanctuary devoted to one nation is really theologically problematic. And so this is a sign of our constant battle, I think, that we have to deal with Christian nationalism, because I recognize that this is in most churches in some place still today. And so how do we do that difficult work? And I would suggest that you don't just I hope I just inspired you, but don't just go home and take the flag out, all right? Because that's a good way to split a church and get fired. Lots of controversies have been started with pastors just suddenly removing the flag, which I think kind of proves the point. I mean, if other than the cross and the Bible, if there's something you can't move out of the sanctuary about a bunch of people getting mad, it probably proves it was an idol to start with. And so we've got to figure out how do we have these conversations now to move people so that they're willing to move this. Maybe we could even have a conversation where we start them where we're least willing to flip it, right? And suggest that we cannot say that the Christian flag is the second kingdom here. But how do we get people to move to seeing that they are part of a global faith? And I think that will go a long way in helping that conversation of disconnecting American and Christian identities by removing a nationalistic symbol from our congregations. So why does all of this matter? I'm going to share this very briefly and then we'll take our break. It matters because when people today are pushing for Christian nationalism, the first picture is the first picture that Speaker Mike Johnson posted when he was elected speaker the first time. He posted that "In God We Trust," which was stamped on the wall of the House chamber in 1963 as a response to the U.S. Supreme Court decisions on prayer and Bible reading. And so a bunch of members of Congress were mad, and they said, well, we'll show them. We'll take down some gold stars and put "God We Trust" there, right? So again, something that's pretty new, and some mainline Protestant politicians created. And he pointed that as proof that we have been put in this position by God, and that we are supposed to be doing God's work here in Congress. When David Barton or Mike Johnson or others point to evidence to suggest that we're supposed to be a Christian nation, they don't often point to the founding era. I talked about that earlier today, right? Because the evidence isn't there unless it's the minority opinion of the politicians who lost that debate. They usually point to stuff that happened in the late 40s, 1950s, and early 60s. Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust" is the national motto, which was also from the 1950s. The National Prayer Breakfast, right? These types of things are the evidence that we mainline Protestants created that is now used to justify a Christian nationalistic agenda today. And that's why I think it was really appropriate in the liturgy this morning. There was the reference about complicity, right? Because that's the part of the story we don't often put in our denominational resolutions condemning Christian nationalism, is our own complicity in it, right? Our own part in participating in creating the Christian nationalism. And we have to name that, because if we don't understand how we got here, then we're not going to make the correct solutions to help us undo and unwind this Christian nationalism. So I want us to, we're going to pause there because I know we have a break now, and I'll be back really soon for the third session, and we'll continue this conversation about thinking about what Christian nationalism looks like today and how it's misusing the Bible.